Hi everyone. So in this tutorial, we are going to look at how we can connect a database to our Flask app. But before we go on, I did realize that I neglected to show you how we can actually match up the password and the password confirm before moving on. So in the last lesson, we received the data via the post request. I'm just going to go if password does not equal password confirm. And I'm going to change the message. And the message is going to become an error message. So I'm going to say error, passwords do not match. And then I need to pass that message back into the page. So currently I've got a variable called message, which is coming into my register page, like so. I'm going to just change the value of that message to equal the message variable from the view function, which is slightly confusing. But all you need to know is that that's the name of the variable that the page is looking for. And this is the value of the variable that I'm using in my page. And if I'm defining my variable here, well, I'm actually going to get a variable out of scope error. So up here, I'm just going to define message as being please register. And that way I won't get the variable out of scope error. Right, so that code should work now. Just to test it out, I'm going to go to my page. I'm going to go to register. I'm just going to type in some stuff. Type in different passwords and confirm, and you'll see error passwords do not match. So that's working now. All right, on with the current tutorial. By the way, if you're not up to date, please, by all means, go to my GitHub, look for the Flask basic template repository, and look for lesson 5. And if you look up lesson 5, you'll be with the code that I've currently got. All right, so we're going to connect a database. Just quickly, there are many different types of databases that we could connect to Flask. The one that we are going to use is an SQLite database. And the reason we're using SQLite is because, one, it's a single file. Two, there's actually language support within Python for SQLite. And three, you don't need to, if it's a student project, you're not going to need hundreds of concurrent connections or thousands of users accessing the database. So for us, SQLite is perfect. Saying that, I haven't actually created the SQLite database for you. I've created an empty database called test.db, but for us, we are going to have to run a create script. And the reason I did that was because my students need to learn how to use create code or create SQL code before their external exams at the end of year 12. So I thought it would be a good activity for students to create their own database. So to do that, I would like you to open up that file inside a DB browser for SQLite. So I'm just going to right click open with, and I'm going to look for DB browser for SQLite. That's free software that you can download. And then once you've opened it, I've already run this by the way, you are actually going to then copy the create script code, and you're going to run that inside executing SQL. And if you run that code, it will create you 2 SQLite tables for you. So run the code, and then I need you to close the database. So you're basically going to write the code, close the database. All right, and once you've done that, your database is ready to use and to connect to. Right, the next step. I have tried to make life easier for my students by creating a file called database interface. And the reason I did that is while SQLite code is quite simple, I just found that you had to keep typing in 3 or 4 lines of code every time you wanted to run an SQL query. And that kind of really frustrated me. So I created my own file just to make it easier for my students. Um, if anyone knows of a better way or an easier way, please contact me. I don't pretend that this code is super efficient. It's definitely not the quickest way because I keep opening and closing the connection all the time. But it's, like I said, it's useful for teaching students simple databasing. So my file is there. You'll find it on my GitHub. And I'm going to use that file to connect to my database. Right. So to do that, I'm going to go up to the top of my app.py file, and I'm actually going to go from the data interfaces folder. From interfaces dot database interface, I'm going to import in the database class. So I've got a class here for a database object. I treat my database as an object. To create the database object, I'm going to create a global variable called database, and I'm going to say it's equal to the database class. I'm just going to give it the location of my database, which is currently in the databases folder, slash test.db. That's the file that I've got here. Obviously, if you bring in your own database, you'll need to change the name and link it differently. And then I'm actually also going to pass in the logger because I want to be able to get SQLite errors inside my log. Right, I just cleared the log because I hadn't done that in a long time. Right, so going back here, I've connected to my database. Now I'm just going to create a really simple view function to see what's inside my database, because as you're debugging, you'll want to see what's going on sometimes. And you don't want to have to keep opening up in DB Browser for SQLite. In fact, I'm not sure you can have DB Browser for SQLite open at the same time as your database is being written to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a view function. I'm just going to call this backdoor. We are going to get rid of it before we've created our entire website, but for the moment, it's useful because it can show us what's inside the database and we can test that everything is working. And then instead of return render template, I'm actually going to query the database and I'm going to then return the results. So to query the database, I'm going to run database.viewQuery. So my database helper file or my database interface file contains two functions. It contains a view query and a modify query. A view query is simply a select. And a modify query could be an insert, update, or delete. All right, so that's going to select all the results from select all users. I'm going to have to store those results somehow. So I'm going to store them inside a variable called results. And for the moment, I'm just going to output those results to the screen. I can do that just by turning the results into like a string. And a really simple way to do that is to use JSONify as a function. I'm going to talk about JSON later on. To be honest, we do JSON a lot in Unit 4. So I'm not sure I'll discuss it again in this tutorial series, but it is something that my students need to learn. So I'm just going to go return JSONify results. And now, if I go to the backdoor URL, it should actually show me what's inside the user's part of my database, which I'm going to do now. So going from the register page, I'm just going to type in slash backdoor, and hopefully it works. It did work. There you go. So it's worked. What you're seeing there, though, shows you the structure of the data that's coming back. And this is something I wanted you to take note of. The data that's coming back is actually a Python dictionary. And the Python dictionary is represented by one row. If there was more than one user, I would have more rows. So one row is represented by a Python dictionary. Multiple rows are represented by a list. And so we actually get a list of Python dictionaries. And that is a really important concept, because when we query the database, we need to know what type of data we're going to get back. It's always going to return a list of Python dictionaries. That's for a view query anyway. And what that means is that if it's a list of Python dictionaries, we can actually get the values by cycling through that list. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there because we've done a lot just in that particular tutorial. In the next tutorial, we'll actually just have a bit more of a look at how we can use the database in a more clever way. Okay, thank you very much for listening.